Hey y'all, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 33, Capitalism and Democracy by Torben Iverson. And so we'll jump into part one, which is the intro. And the main puzzle here is, how do capitalism and democracy, which both sort of seem at odds with each other, exist, right? And the reason they're sort of at odds at each other, right, is because capitalism, as we know, generates inequality. It's inevitable. It's one of Marx's criticisms and other critics. Um, Capitalism inevitably creates inequality, um, but democracy, on the other hand, gives the poor the ability to wildly redistribute wealth. So why don't we see that sort of across the world? Hmm. Okay, so we'll jump into part two: precursors for the contemporary literature. And Jaworski and Wallerstein, Jaworski we read earlier in the semester, who talks about sort of the evolution of good political and banking or economic institutions at once. Um, but anyway, Jaworski and Wallerstein, basically go about trying to answer the question, why don't the poor just take the rich's wealth, right, in a democratic system? Um, and as we sort of talked about in the former chapter, we know that radical redistribution by the poor would tend to lead to, first of all, massive disinvestment by the elites, and possible violence, right, by the elites as well. So the masses can't really take it too far, right? And on the other hand, the rich, why would they consent to giving up their power to a democracy? Like we learned earlier, they might consent to this just because the repression costs are too high, or they might cause a revolution, right? Um, but this still doesn't really explain the variance sort of across the world in democratic and political institutions and what they look like, and things like redistribution. And sort of the level of redistribution, right? We know that redistribution can go from sort of really high levels of redistribution, like Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Denmark, uh, Finland, those sort of Scandinavian states, versus more like continental Europe, like Germany, France, Italy. You sort of have like a middling social security system. And then you get to countries like Japan, England, the United States, we have very poor social security systems. So, while Jaworski and Wallerstein's paper is great, it doesn't explain the variance, right? And so Meltzer and Richards' answer is to just consider the median voter, right? And this was a lot of the answer that we got in sort of the 80s and 90s, when they were just kicking off with this sort of political economy theory and what they call game theoretics. So Richard and Meltzer say to consider the median voter. Um, the median voter is generally going to be under the median income, because there's generally a skew in the wealth, where the rich sort of skew it because they're extremely rich, right? And so the median voter should be under the median income, and so this should inevitably lead to um, at least wanting some redistribution, and depending on the level of inequality in your society and the dependent on the number of poor people in your society who actually vote, you'll get either smaller or greater incentives for redistributive policies. Um, but this is exactly opposite of what we see in the real world. In the real world, what we see is that the most income inequality and the poor voting to turn out have the worst redistributive systems, right? Whereas the more egalitarian countries like Scandinavia tend to have the biggest social safety nets. And so Meltzer and Richards doesn't really fit. Hmm. So then we move on to power theory. And we have two power theories. Basically, power resource theory says that redistribution is a function of the power of the organized labor class and its relationship with the middle class. And if you have a strong organized labor class and unions who are sort of tied together with the middle classes, you'll see more redistributive policies. Whereas if you see the middle class sort of tied to the wealthy, you'll see fewer redistributive policies. And then there's neo-corporatist theory, which is a power theory as well, which says, okay, yes, it is about labor's relationship, but it's about the relationship of the actual state, right? And you'll see more redistributive policy making when labor has some say over policy making or decision making. So in Europe, what we find is many European countries have laws that say that a certain percentage of a company's board members must be um, um, a regular laborer, basically, an employee of the company, and not someone in upper management. And many times these are labor union members. And so they get not only a say on the corporate board, which does not happen, right, in the U.S. or in Japan. They get a say on the corporate board, but many times they'll have union members on government boards and things of that sort as well. And again, we don't really do that much in the U.S. except for sort of the National Labor Relations Board, but it's a pretty weak institution. Okay, so there's some problems though with these approaches. The first is that there's no real statistical evidence for these ideas. And both are kind of problematic in that they pit basically labor against employers, but why not think about the sector or occupational groups or religion or other cleavages, race? And so, there's problems with these. Okay, we'll move to part 3, democracy and partisanship. And so they're basically just saying here in this section that partisanship should be more important in explaining redistributive policies than either the median voter theory or sort of the power theories, right? Um, and that, if you look at the data, it's obvious that labor, no matter how strong they are, um, is going to get pushed back by conservative administration. So, while labor was pretty strong in England and, arguably at least stronger than it is today in the United States in the 1970s, when Margaret Thatcher, the UK Prime Minister who came in the early 80s, and Ronald Reagan, who came in 1980, um, when their administrations entered, they went on a kick against labor unions, basically, and so kind of regardless of where the labor union's position is, if you get a conservative administration, you're going to get conservative policy. So we have to think about partisanship, and I'll just sort of leave it there, and we'll move on. Part 4 talks about multidimensionality. So, in all of the sort of median voter theory considerations we've had so far, we've been talking about sort of a singular ideological line, basically, right? And they're saying that's also not really realistic. So, we're going to add multidimensionality to the equation. And they start with Epsing Anderson's work in 1990, who kind of kicked this all off. And he says there's actually 3 approaches, not 2. It's not just labor versus the rich, right? As we've sort of seen before, or redistribution versus not. There's 3 different redistributive sort of regimes that we can consider. The first is sort of the social democratic regime. This is the most progressive type of, or the most redistributive type of regime. You get highly progressive taxes and all receive benefits, right? So these are, again, like the Scandinavian nations, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, etc. And it generally, what'll happen is you see in society a pitting of the public versus the private sector, basically. because private sector is frustrated that there's so much redistribution and such high taxes, whereas the public is pushing for them. And then you have the second regime, which is the liberal, which is sort of the moderate regime. And these are the middling cases I was talking about earlier, right? Germany, France, those sorts of states. They have means tested programs, so they're more widespread, far more widespread than in, say, the United States or the United Kingdom, but they're not nearly as sort of globally widespread as they are in, Finland and Norway. Um, and so this generally tends to lead to sort of poor versus the middle class, right? And then the third regime is the conservative regime of say, Reagan or Thatcher. Japan tends to take things very, very conservatively. Um, and so, again, these are just the sort of three approaches instead of just taking a sort of unidimensional approach. And he gives some examples. He doesn't really do a lot of like data research, but he gives some like post hoc historical, what do they call it? Thick description is what they call it in the social sciences, when you're just sort of, I don't know, looking at observations and trying to fit together how they work without any sort of science behind it, right? Data collection and that sort of thing. So his examples are first that in I think it was Scotland, the socialist environmental groups sort of banded together and forced socialist parties to enforce large scale redistribution. So this is Sweden, Finland, those states that had strong sort of communist or socialist parties. Um, in France and Germany, the middling course, you still had redistribution, but it's a lot less widespread. And here, sort of, the state partnered with corporations in these countries, especially post World War II, um, to ensure that sort of the poor didn't enforce to ensure that labor unions and socialist parties didn't have their way, basically. And then if you look at like the U.S. and England, they were very, very anti-socialist, anti-communist. The FBI would watch people. They would put them in jail. There were the HUAC, the House Un-American Committee, led by what is that guy's name? Joe McCarthy, something McCarthy. Anyway, so in U.S. and in England, where these sort of left wing associations were suppressed, we see far less redistribution. We also have things like work requirements and drug tests and a lot of bureaucracy that you have to get past to get help. And then the level of help is generally pretty low. I know that here in Texas, TANF payouts are only like $220 a month for 6 months. It's called the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. And in the South, especially, it is very, very lowly funded, as are food stamps and things like that. So our social security nets in the United States are pretty poorly compared to many European states. Okay. And then there's a little section on adding racial politics instead of looking at just multidimensional systems and how they arise. Um, and if you add sort of a second dimension other than just, now we're not considering only redistribution, now we're considering race and redistribution. If you add a new dimension of race, it can lead to sort of an equilibrium of low redistribution if race is important, right? And especially if voters are voting racially based. We also find in Alesina and Glaser and a lot of other literature, actually, that when racial groups are concerned about redistributing wealth to a different minority racial group, you tend not to get any redistribution, right? And so this is sort of the phenomenon that we see in the South, where whites, where sort of the more whites fear that their social safety spending, their tax dollars are just going to poor blacks, you don't see any social safety spending. And we see this sort of across the world and across the United States, where this phenomenon occurs, where if there's a sort of a large majority group and a small minority group, we see redistribution drop where those minority groups exist. And we see redistribution increase where everyone sort of looks the same, right? So it's a concerning phenomenon. Okay, part 5, democratic institutions. Instead of focusing on what we've been focusing before, like median voter, or the power theories, or these sorts of things, now we're going to shift the focus to political institutions as what sort of drives the variables in redistributive policy, right? And there's sort of a couple of approaches. There's electoral rules. So Carey and Shugart in 1995, in a really famous paper, say in those nations where the party controls the candidates, redistribution should be a lot more widespread, right? And in those nations where the candidates have a lot more power, there should be a lot more sort of barrel politics where money is just getting sent to people's home districts, especially tight races. And so that's what you see in Japan and the United States, where the party has very little control because of primary systems and things of that sort, versus a country like Australia or some of the partyless systems in Europe, where you vote for a party and then the party chooses who the candidate is. You see more redistributive policies. And then Person and Tabellini in 2000 say it's about the electoral formula, right? And we've gotten a lot of support for this theory over time, that single member districts like the US, the UK, Japan should have um, resources basically only going to competitive districts so that they can win those competitive districts and try and win a majority in the House or the Senate, right? Whereas those districts that have a large district magnitude, like Israel or others, where there are multiple people coming out of the same district, your promises to your electorate have to be a lot more widespread, and therefore your policies tend to be much more widespread. All right, so that's all I've got for you today. It was a little bit of a short one. I hope you enjoyed it. Y'all have a great day, and I'll see you for the next one, which will be chapter 34, Inequality, by Edward Glaeser of Harvard University. All right, thanks so much. Have a great day.